Hello, and welcome to Lewis and Clark Law School's Office of Alumni Relations and Boley Law Library Book Talk with Ozan Varol. We're so glad you could make it today. My name is Meredith Kostek, and I'm a research and instruction librarian at Boley Law Library, and I'm excited to be your moderator today for this book talk. Before we begin, I would like to thank Judy Asbury, Tess Jacobson, and Henry Van Buren for all their help in making this webinar happen. Additionally, I'd like to take the time to acknowledge the land where Lewis and Clark Law School stands. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Here in the United States, some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building a mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. Lewis and Clark Law School is located in Portland, Oregon and Multnomah County. Prior to the newcomers coming to this area, the indigenous land of this area was home to many tribal people. Today, we honor the indigenous people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand: the Multnomah, Clackamas, Clackamas, Tumwater, Waltala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. And remembering these communities, we honor their legacies, their lives, and their descendants. Let's take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the format for today's book talk. First, author and Professor Ozan Varol will talk about some key principles from his latest book, I have it right here, Think Like a Rocket Scientist. Then I'll ask several questions specific to the book and many of our listeners. Finally, we will open up with a discussion to you. You may type your questions in the Q&A tab and we will get to as many as possible. Now, let me introduce to you our special guest today, author, law school professor, podcaster, soccer enthusiast, and former rocket scientist, Ozan Varol. Ozan grew up in Istanbul, Turkey, and came to Cornell University to pursue astrophysics. This pursuit led to being a member of the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers mission. Ozan next turned to the law, graduating from the University of Iowa College of Law. Before entering academia, Ozan practiced law in complex civil and white-collar criminal defense litigation. Ozan came to Lewis and Clark in 2012 and is a professor of law in the areas of constitutional law, criminal law and procedure, and comparative constitutional law. Already an acclaimed author, this year brought a new type of pursuit for Ozan with his book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist. The book combines 9 principles from rocket science that we can use in everyday life to inspire us to take our own moonshot and enable us to achieve liftoff. Ozan Varol.
Thank you very much, Meredith. Let me share my screen here. Can you see it, Meredith? Great. Okay, I'll get rolling. In September 1962, President John F. Kennedy stepped up to the podium at Rice University Stadium and pledged to land a man on the moon before the decade was out. Now, at the time, a moon landing was quite literally a moonshot. Several of the prerequisites that would be required to land on the moon just hadn't been done yet. So no American astronaut had worked outside of a spacecraft. 2 spacecraft had never docked together in space. NASA didn't know if the lunar surface was solid enough to support a lander, whether the communication system would work on the moon. Kennedy said some of the metals required to build the rockets hadn't even been invented yet. We jumped into the cosmic void and hoped that we'd grow wings on the way up. And grow those wings we did. Just less than 7 years after Kennedy's pledge, Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. Now, to set that in context in terms of a timeline, a child who was just 6 years old when the Wright brothers took their first flight, which lasted about 10 seconds and moved like all of 100 feet, would have been 72 when flight became powerful enough to put a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. I mean, think about that for a moment. That's a giant leap taken within a single human lifespan, like 66 years from Wright brothers to Neil Armstrong. And that giant leap is often celebrated as the triumph of technology, but it wasn't. It was the triumph of a certain thought process that rocket scientists used to turn the impossible, the seemingly impossible, into the possible. And as Meredith said, I talk about that thought process in my book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, which just came out earlier this year. So in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so, I'm going to share with you a few strategies from the book. You'll learn how to reimagine what's possible, how to eliminate outdated assumptions that are cluttering your thinking, how to reframe problems to generate better answers, and how to pave the way to landing your moonshot. The strategies I discuss in the book, I wrote the book way before the pandemic happened, but they became particularly relevant in the wake of the pandemic. There's just so much uncertainty in the world right now, but rocket scientists have to solve really seemingly insurmountable problems under conditions of enormous uncertainty. And so we can all benefit from thinking like a rocket scientist right now. So let's delve in here. And I'm going to begin with reasoning from first principles. And the example here is SpaceX. SpaceX made headlines a few months ago when they became the first private company to take humans into space, to dock with the International Space Station. Only 3 governments in the world have been able to accomplish that feat. So US, China, and Russia are the only 3 governments. So SpaceX beat everybody else to the finish line, including other major governments, including other established industry players like Boeing. How did they do it? What was their secret? Well, one of their secrets was first principles thinking. So this is Elon Musk that you're looking at here. When he was first thinking about sending rockets to Mars one day, he had just sold, he was a co-founder of PayPal. He sold PayPal to eBay. He learned rocket science actually by reading books. So after he sold the company, he was on a beach in Brazil, leafing through, fundamentals of rocket propulsion, your typical beach read. And he decided to send rockets to Mars one day. And he initially began by shopping for rockets that other people had built. He looked on the American market. The rockets here were way too expensive. He went to Russia to shop for, I kid you not, decommissioned intercontinental ballistic missiles that he could repurpose as rockets. But those also were too expensive. And on one of his trips back from Russia, he had an epiphany. He realized that his approach had been flawed all along. And he arrived at that epiphany using first principles thinking. So first principles thinking, which comes from physics, is a way of hacking through the assumptions in your life as if you're hacking through a jungle with a machete, getting rid of all of the weeds until you're left with the non-negotiable raw materials in front of you. And you build it back up from there. When you apply first principles thinking, you go from being a cover band that plays somebody else's music to being an original singer, songwriter that goes back to the raw materials and constructs something new from scratch. So in shopping for rockets that other people had built, Elon Musk realized that he was playing the role of a cover band. He asked himself, what does it actually take to build?
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your audio is cutting in and out.
Okay, let me, sure. Let me switch input here, and hopefully that will fix it. Just one moment. Switching to a different input now. Let me know if the same problem happens again. Can you hear me okay right now?
I can, thank you.
Okay, great, sure. Thank you for letting me know. So he asked himself, well, what does it actually take to build a rocket and to put one in space? It turns out that if you just buy the raw materials of a rocket yourself and build a rocket from scratch, it's like 2% of the typical price of a rocket. So he decided to just build his own rockets from scratch as opposed to buying rockets that other people had built. And so you're looking at here in the inside of a SpaceX factory where the next generation rockets are being designed from scratch. First principles thinking led SpaceX to question another deeply held assumption in rocket science. And that assumption was that rockets couldn't be reused once they delivered their cargo into orbit. For decades, they would burn up in the atmosphere or plunge into the ocean, requiring an entirely new rocket to be rebuilt. Now imagine for a moment doing the same thing with commercial flights. Like I'm in Portland right now, I fly to New York, get off the plane, the passengers deplane, and then somebody steps up to the plane and just torches it. Sounds crazy, but that's what we did for rockets for decades. And actually the price of a Boeing 737 isn't all that different from a modern rocket, but space flight is so much more expensive because rockets, unlike airplanes, couldn't be reused. But first principles thinking is on its way to changing that as well. So you're looking here at two boosters from the SpaceX Falcon Heavy landing back on solid ground. There's now a landing pad next to the launch pad at Kennedy Space Center, and that's a new thing in rocket science. And there's so many examples of this type of thinking outside of rocket science as well. So we used to assume that you needed bank loans and venture capital funding to be able to start a new business or launch a new product. Questioning those assumptions gave us Kickstarter. We used to assume that you needed a brick and mortar store and late fees to be able to rent videos. Questioning those assumptions gave us Netflix. So over to you. This is a question that I ask myself on a fairly regular basis. Do I own my assumptions, or do my assumptions own me? There's a quote I love from Alan Alda. It's often misattributed to Isaac Asimov, but he says, your assumptions are your windows on the world. Scrub them off once in a while, or the light won't come in. So what do you assume you're supposed to do simply because you've done it before? Or what do you assume you're supposed to do simply because other people around you are doing it? Can you question that assumption and replace it with something better? It's often through shedding the assumptions cluttering our thinking, like a snake sheds its old skin to be able to emerge with the new, that you can chart the way to a better tomorrow. All right, so that's first principles thinking. I'm now going to switch into reframing problems to generate better answers. And we're going to begin with a challenge here. And this comes from a Stanford professor. Her name is Tina Seelig, and she uses this challenge in a class on entrepreneurship. This is a real exercise. She walks into the classroom, divides up the class into different teams. And she says, each team will have $5 in funding. And she says, you've got 2 hours to make as much money as possible, and then give a 3-minute presentation to the class. So those are your marching orders here. You've got $5, make as much money as possible in 2 hours, and give a 3-minute presentation to the class. Now, the typical idea that emerges from here is that the teams take the $5 in funding and they do things like, buy materials for a lemonade stand, and they sell lemonade like they did back when they were 6 years old. Or they buy materials for a car wash and just set up a car wash on the street. One team had the idea of going to Vegas and putting the $5 on Reddit, the roulette table, and seeing what happens from there. But all of those teams that follow the typical paths don't do very well. The teams that tend to do better realize that the $5 is essentially a distracting and worthless resource. So they go back to first principles and frame the problem more broadly as, what do we do to make the most amount of money if we start with absolutely nothing? So one team had the great idea. So Stanford is near Silicon Valley. They had the idea of making reservations for popular times at Silicon Valley restaurants, and then selling the reservation times to wealthy executives who wanted to skip the wait. So the team that did that, I think they got about $300 in 2 hours. But the team that came in first, they realized that both the 2-hour time period and the $5 were not the most valuable resources in their toolbox. Rather, the most valuable resource in their toolbox was the 3-minute presentation time they had in front of a captivated Stanford class. So they sold that 3-minute period to a company that was interested in recruiting Stanford students and walked away with $650. So the $5 challenge is there to illustrate the difference between tactics and strategy. These terms are used interchangeably, but they refer to different things. So a strategy is an overall plan for achieving an objective, but tactics are the tools you use, the actions you take to actually achieve that strategy. Now, we're often blinded by the tools and tactics that are sitting in front of us. It's like that old saying, right? If you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. But just because there's a $5 bill sitting in front of you doesn't make it the most optimal tool for the job. This is a quote from Neil Gaiman. He says, "Tools can be the subtlest of traps." It's only when you're able to zoom out and ask yourself, all right, well, I have these tools in front of me, but what are they here to serve? What am I trying to do here? What is the North Star, the overall strategy? And when you define the overall strategy, you're often able to step back, zoom out of a flawed tactic, and see other possibilities, like the 2 hours and the 3 minutes that the more successful teams were able to see. So ask yourself, what is the $5 tactic in your life? How do you replace that and find the more valuable 2 hours? Or even better, how do you find that like 3-minute presentation time that's lurking in plain sight, but that you're not able to see because you're too in the weeds and stuck with, applying the same tactics over and over again? Breakthroughs, contrary to popular wisdom, don't begin with a smart answer. They begin with a smart question that reframes the problem to illuminate other possibilities. All right, and then finally, talk about moonshot thinking. We already got a glimpse of this when I mentioned the JFK speech, him stepping up to the podium. That was our first literal moonshot, but humans have been taking metaphorical moonshots for thousands of years now. I mean, our first ancestors who blazed a trail into the unknown, they took a moonshot. The builders of pyramids, the inventors of the wheel, the discoverers of the fire, they were all taking moonshots. It was a moonshot for slaves to reach for freedom, for women to take the ballot, for refugees to push toward distant shores in search of a better life. We're a species of moonshots, even though we've largely forgotten it. We've been seduced into believing that small dreams are wiser than moonshots, that coasting is better than soaring, that flying lower is safer than flying higher. But altitude, as any pilot will tell you, is your friend. I used to be a pilot, FAA licensed private pilot in college, and one of the things you learn very early on is if your engine quits at high altitudes, you have options for gliding your plane to safety. But at low altitudes, the possibilities in flight, just like the possibilities in life, tend to be more limited. Now, moonshots also force you to reason from first principles. If your goal is to just improve incrementally, then you can work within the status quo. But if your goal is 10x improvement, then the status quo has to go. Pursuing a moonshot puts you in a different league, or even in a completely different game than everybody else. So the established habits and processes and routines become irrelevant. So here's an example. If your goal is to better protect human life in the case of a car accident, you can make gradual improvements to the design of a car to better protect the humans inside of it. But if your goal is a moonshot of eliminating all accidents, all car accidents, then you have to start with a blank slate and question all assumptions, including the human operator behind the wheel. And that paves the way for the possibility of self-driving vehicles. My path here, this is a photo of me. My path here was a result of moonshot thinking. As Meredith mentioned, I grew up in Istanbul. My family didn't speak any English. They had never been to the United States before. We lived in this tiny apartment, and we get blackouts all the time. And when I was like 3, 4 years old, these would just terrify me. So my dad, who you're seeing in the photo here, he doesn't have a mustache anymore. He did back then though. He came up with this game. He would take one of my soccer ball. He would light a candle, and then he'd rotate the soccer ball around the candle to show how the Earth rotated around the sun, to distract me from these blackouts. Those were my first astronomy lessons, and I was hooked. My moonshot very quickly became working on a space mission someday, and I learned English as a second language. I taught myself how to do computer programming. I researched how to get into colleges in the United States, do a good astrophysics program, and all of those were a combination of dreaming big and also charting out a very specific path to getting there. I eventually got into Cornell to study astrophysics, and 2 weeks before I left Turkey for the United States, I researched what the astronomy department at Cornell was up to and found out that one of the professors there was in charge. He was the principal investigator of a NASA-led mission to Mars. There was no job application, but I just wrote him an email expressing my burning desire to work for him. And I almost, by the way, did not click send on that email. Right as I was about to click send, this voice, the voice of the inner critic, came up and said, "Who are you to send this email to this person, to this important person, right? You're a skinny kid with a funny name from a country halfway around the globe. What can you possibly contribute?" And that self-doubt still comes up. But whenever it does, I think back to that day, to that moment when I actually overcame that moment of self-doubt and clicked send. And that one action landed me a pinch me now job working on the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers project. So if you think back to the biggest regrets in your life, if they're anything like mine, they tend to be the things that you thought about doing but didn't do. And I think what sets apart universe thinkers from the rest, the moonshot thinkers from the rest, is their willingness to take action, to fly in the face of uncertainty, to leap into the unknown when the rest of the world remains stationary. And I'll wrap this up with this final concluding thought, and then we'll transition into some questions. There's a scene at Apollo 13 is one of my favorite movies of all time. There's a scene at the end of the movie, actually it's at the beginning of the movie, where Jim Lovell, who's played by Tom Hanks, he is watching on television as Neil Armstrong takes his giant leap for mankind. And Jim Lovell is a NASA astronaut. He was the backup commander for the Apollo 11 mission that took Neil and Buzz to the lunar surface. So Jim is watching the TV, and he looks at the TV and he says, it wasn't a miracle. We just decided to go. All breakthroughs are reasonable only in hindsight. The day before a major breakthrough, it's a completely unreasonable idea. But if we restrict ourselves to what's possible, given the status quo, we'll never reach escape velocity and create a future that's worth getting excited about. Because in the end, all moonshots are miracles until you decide to go. I'll stop there, Meredith. I know you've got some questions for me to kick things off, so we can transition to that before taking questions from the audience.
I do, and thank you so much for that insight. And it was, if you enjoyed what he had to say, really reading his book will bring all of those great insights into even more clarity for you. So I do recommend it. So I'm going to turn, you started talking a little bit about the pandemic and uncertainty. My first question has to do with that. Your book begins with many discussions on uncertainty. Reading your book during a pandemic has allowed me to see many of the innovative ideas brought from this uncertainty come to fruition. Would you talk a little about how you see this time of uncertainty as a stepping off point for unleashing this potential?
Yeah, so all scientific breakthroughs happen in in uncertain conditions. We tend to be really afraid of uncertainty for various different reasons. I mean, I think there's an evolutionary component to this. Our ancestors who were not afraid of uncertainty didn't live long enough to pass on their genes to us. They became food to a saber-toothed tiger. But those who were afraid of the unknown ended up surviving and passing their genes on to us. And so uncertainty, I think, is very much wired into our DNA, but it also can be, so it's served an evolutionary advantage. But in the modern world, it can very much be paralyzing, because if we're afraid of uncertainty, if we don't know exactly what tomorrow is going to look like, then we just stay stationary. We stick with the status quo. And so in conditions of uncertainty, the brain steers toward the seemingly safest path, which is inaction. And I say seemingly safest because often inaction is not safe. And so how do you develop this mindset of working with uncertainty and using uncertainty to your advantage even? And so there's a number of tactics I talk about in the book, but two of them jump out. One of them is, in conditions of uncertainty, we try to control what cannot be controlled, and then we don't control what can be controlled. So there's just sort of this paradox where, like, and this actually happened to me. So my book came out on April 14th. At the height of the pandemic, I had this big book tour plan that was going to travel all across the United States and give talks. And of course, with the pandemic shutting travel down, my book tour was canceled. I spent 2 days just being miserable, wishing reality to be different than what it was for my book tour to come back. And, you know, I realized that's a profoundly useless exercise. It's not productive at all. I was not thinking like a rocket scientist. So then I went back to my rocket science training and asked myself, all right, I can't change the hand that the universe dealt me, but how can I play the hand that I do have? How can I use my skills and resources and services in a way that I haven't used them before to be able to get the ideas in the book out into the world? So I ended up doing a number of virtual events, which actually ended up being, I think, far more successful than a physical book tour ever would have been. And I realized when that happened that in setting up a book tour, I was not reasoning from first principles. I love meeting readers in person, but it's not efficient for me to get on a flight to New York, go into Barnes & Noble, give a talk to 50 people, and then come right back to Portland. That's 2 days right there. And I could do the same thing through this format that we're doing right now. And so that's one question that I think, to the extent that the pandemic has disrupted what you're doing, asking yourself, well, how can you use your skills, products, resources, services to solve the problems that the world needs solving right now, as opposed to the problems that you expected to solve, as opposed to the problems that you wanted to solve. I think, and I'll stop there, because I think that, honestly, that reframing of letting go of what you cannot control and focusing on what you can control is one of the most important pivots that one can make in being able to deal with uncertainty and embrace it.
That's great. Thank you. So knowing you would be speaking, oh, I skipped my second question. In your chapter on moonshot thinking, you discuss the writing of your book as both divergent thinking in the gathering of all the information in it and convergent thinking in the editing. Would you describe your process of generating your ideas and gathering your sources of information to write this book? And then how did you flip from that very divergent thinking to a convergent way of thinking so you could pare down all of your sources and find the most relevant sources for each chapter?
Sure. So let me begin by defining divergent thinking and convergent thinking. So divergent thinking is a way of open-ended thinking. It's like setting the inner editor, the inner critic aside, and just gathering sources, gathering ideas, you know, applying science fiction thinking, basically, and not thinking about limits and constraints or even proper grammar, just collecting everything and putting it all down on paper. And so an idea generation ideally should begin with divergent thinking. Because often, and I'm sure those who are tuning in can relate to this, whenever you're in a brainstorming meeting, people are often busy shooting down ideas as opposed to generating them, right? It's like, well, we can't do this because our budget, our software, our supply chain, or this or that does not allow it. But switching from a we can't to a we can if mindsets. That's the hallmark of divergent thinking. In the context of writing my book, it was a way for me to, I had about a year to write the book. And once you have the idea for a book, and I had the book proposal accepted by my publisher, it's almost like setting up an antenna. Like you become a receptor for all sorts of signals because you begin to see the world differently, basically. Now I have this book to write. Everything becomes fodder, potential fodder for the book. And initially, in the initial stages, I did not edit those ideas down at all. So I would collect everything from all different sources. I mean, there are movie references in the book, from like Jaws and Contact to popular references like Rolling Stones. I think Bon Jovi makes an appearance somewhere. So I was collecting all of this stuff into this pile, basically. But I wasn't editing. And I'm sure there are a lot of lawyers listening to this. When you're writing a brief, one of the worst things you can do is to let that inner editor into the process at the very beginning stages. There's a lot to be said about letting your inner self just run free with that first draft. And that's exactly what I did, was to just collect all these ideas. A lot of them were not good. I would say I probably ended up, 80% of them didn't end up making it into the book, but you can't tell what the valuable 20% are going to be until you've collected all those ideas in one place, and you can look at them from a different perspective. And so that was the beginning. And then after that, divergent thinking got replaced with convergent thinking. And so convergent thinking is where you introduce limits and constraints. Limits in my case being like, I had a length limit, for example, for the book that I couldn't exceed. And then you start paring things down, cutting things down, editing. And I find that very useful, following with divergent thinking, and then inserting convergent thinking into the picture only later on down the line. If you flip it and begin with convergent thinking, that's when like writer's block happens. That's when you can't string sentences together because you're trying to write and edit at the same time, which is really, really hard to do. Some people can do it, but if you look at most great writers, they always say, look, the first draft is not good. The first draft is for me. I'm just going to get these ideas down. And the great thing about getting that first draft down is that you can just edit it. You can make it better, but you can't edit a blank page. And so hence the importance of beginning with divergent thinking before transitioning to convergent thinking.
Great advice. And so now, knowing you would be speaking to a mostly legal audience today, I read your book, keeping a special eye out for tips and practices for the legal community. I was especially interested in the way you discuss reframing your opinions in your chapter on the power of flip-flopping and how that might help when forming legal arguments for briefs and oral arguments. What are some specific legal-minded takeaways you have from your book that practitioners can use in their day-to-day practice?
So the power of flip-flopping, just to give some context to the audience there, of course, flip-flopping is often viewed pejoratively. It's often used to like mock politicians to change their minds. But a scientist who changes their mind is just doing their job. It's the job of a scientist to come up with hypotheses and to try to falsify them. So to prove themselves wrong, which completely runs counter to the way that most of us operate. Most of us are wired to confirm what we think is true and then reject all conflicting advice. But a good scientist is trying to falsify their ideas, prove themselves wrong all the time. And so I think one of the takeaways there for a legal community or a legal audience is, and I tell my students this in class too, the best lawyers are those who know the opposition's argument better than the opposition does. And that's one of the things that I try to instill in my students in the classroom is the ability to see, like a scientist, to be able to see the issue from multiple different perspectives and to be able to switch perspectives and see what the other side is seeing. Because if you can see that, if you can formulate the other side's arguments better than the other side can, you are well positioned to do such a better job of writing a brief that takes the wind out of your opponent's sails, because you're able to see somebody else's truth. And I should say, and I see this in the classroom too, that is such a rare skill.
it's a rare skill because we don't learn it in school for the most part. You know, the education system, unfortunately, you know, middle school, high school, elementary school as well, it's a series of right answers, right? There's a single right answer to each question that's asked. That right answer was figured out by someone far smarter than you, and your job is to memorize that right answer so you can spit it back out on a standardized test. And that system, unfortunately, does a terrible job of preparing us to be able to cope with the real world, because in the real world, right answers are quite cheap. By the time that, you know, Alexa or Google can spit out the right answer, the world has moved on. It's your ability to cope with uncertainty, to be able to see multiple right answers. I think that will set you apart from everybody else, but the conditions aren't there because we're also operating in this world from these echo chambers. You know, we follow people like us on Twitter, we befriend like-minded people on Facebook, and so then the echo chambers get louder and louder with the sounds of the same voices. So then we don't recognize the arguments that exist on the other side. But if you don't know what those arguments are, you won't be able to engage with them. You won't be able to rebut them, and you'll be blindsided. So I think switching the mode of operation from going from I'm going to try to prove myself right to acting like Charles Darwin, who would, whenever he encountered a fact, an opinion that didn't agree with his, he would write it down immediately, because he knew we were all weak in that respect. He knew if he didn't write it down immediately, that his brain would basically eventually, well, would just sort of deject that idea, push it to the sides to be able to confirm what he thinks he knows. And so that's really, I think that's a great exercise for a lawyer to engage in, and a great mindset to adopt.
Great, and I think we're seeing a lot with the pandemic and scientists working almost in real time as we see this same process that we aren't used to, because we want the answer and we want it to be the right answer, versus let us get rid of all of the other things in it. So it's an interesting world to step into, the science world instead of our regular legal world. So
yeah.
Well, you talked about your $5 tactic, and my $5 tactic is in legal research. As a law librarian, legal research is my main way of communication with the world. I teach it formally and informally all the time. And services like Westlaw and Lexis are often the hammers for all legal research jobs, when in fact maybe Hein Online's wrench or ProQuest screwdriver might be a better for one's legal research. So how can we help define legal research in terms of strategy and tactics so that it's obvious to students the merit in stepping back and understanding all the tools specifically in legal research? So.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, the answer is embedded in your question, Meredith, which is like, you can do the $5 challenge, right? And say, look, sometimes Westlaw and Lexis are the $5 in the $5 challenge. Just because they're easy, just because they're like Google, or you can just dream up some search that you think will get you the right result, doesn't make them the best tool for the job. Now, one of the best things that I did in practice in terms of uncovering insights that became relevant to briefs I was writing was like picking up a treatise. Instead of jumping on Westlaw, actually picking up a treatise, reading, getting an overall picture of what's going on, and then also reading, like, not just a section that was immediately relevant to the case I was working on, but also surrounding sections as well, which you can't really do in Westlaw. It's so much easier with a print treatise to be able to do that. Scanning the table of contents, I was able to identify several issues that I think I would have missed if I had just like went on Westlaw and looked up specifically the issue that concerned my client at the time. So I think for lawyers, that's important to do. So asking yourself, what is the overall strategy here? What am I trying to achieve? And am I being captive to a particular tactic? That tactic could be Westlaw and Lexis. And sometimes Westlaw and Lexis, by the way, are going to be the 3 minutes in the $5 challenge. They are going to be the best tools for the job, but they're not the right tools every time. And so being more intentional and purposeful and asking yourself what the overall strategy is, and then thinking through the most appropriate tactics, I think is a great thing to do.
Yes, and now I think I'm going to take that little section and play it at the beginning of every legal research class that I teach. So like, don't forget, we can do this. My final question for today is geared towards students. So we also have many students listening in today, and your chapter on failure titled "Nothing Succeeds Like Failure" has some great insight on why failure, especially when in the relatively safe environment of school, will help students more than empty success. What do you say to students to help them see failure as a growth opportunity, and how would you encourage students to embrace this idea?
Yeah. So failure, or the fear of failure, along with the fear of uncertainty, I think those go hand in hand in stopping us from taking action. Um, I think behind every canvas unpainted, every book unwritten, every business unlaunched, every song unsung is a looming fear of failure. And that comes in part, I think, because of the way that most of us are raised, where there's a value judgment attached to failure, right? Success is good and failure is bad. And when you fail, you must have done something wrong. And that, I think, gets inculcated from our families, from the education system, and then we bring that fear of failure into the modern world. And I see this in the classes I teach as well. So I think that there are a number of things to keep in mind here, and some of which I talk about in the book. One is the idea that breakthroughs tend to be evolutionary, not revolutionary, which means if you're trying to achieve something transformative, you're not going to succeed on the first try. Like we talked about SpaceX. SpaceX's first 3 launches were spectacular failures. The company was on the verge of bankruptcy in 2008 when their 4th launch succeeded. Einstein's first several proofs for E=mc² failed. Thomas Edison famously said, "I haven't failed. I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." And so thinking through failure as a learning opportunity, I think is a really important reframing of the problem here. Going back to the reframing questions, because if you're learning from each iteration, and the next iteration is better than the one that came before it, it's pretty incredible what people are able to accomplish. I think what gets in our way is being focused on too much on chasing short-term outcomes. If your goal is success tomorrow, then failure is going to hit you really hard if you don't succeed tomorrow. But if you're able to adjust your time horizon, so you're looking down 3-5 years down the road, then a failure that happens tomorrow isn't that hard hitting, because you've got a longer time horizon and you're working towards this moonshot, and you're going to have inevitable failures along the way. The other part is, I think, getting used to failing is part of it too. One of my heroes is Sarah Blakely. She is the founder of Spanx, the underwear company. She went from selling fax machines door to door to becoming the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. And she attributes her success, at least partially, to a question that her father would ask her growing up regularly. He would ask her, "What have you failed at recently? And what did you learn from it?" I think that's a question that most parents don't ask their children, because the conversations all tend to be around success, right? You got an A+ on your exam, way to go. You made the volleyball team, amazing. But in asking his children what they failed at each week, Sarah's father gave them the breathing room to tackle interesting problems, and to fail from time to time. Because to him, failing to try was far worse than failure itself. I've failed more times than I care to remember in my life, and every time it sucked. There's no denying it. Like in the short term, failure sucks. But if you're able to zoom out and see the bigger picture and see the failure as a stepping stone, and the way to do that, by the way, is by taking data from failure, by learning something from it. Failure can be the best teacher if you know how to approach it properly. That's allowed me when I was applying for clerkships, for example, God, I applied to maybe 150 judges and got rejected from like 140 of them, 145 of them. Got 5 interviews, ended up getting 2 offers. Yeah, it takes one, exactly, right? It takes one. But I think if you're afraid of rejection, then you're gonna play it safe. And the thing is, what you strive for becomes your ceiling, And so if you're aiming low because you don't want to get rejected, then you're artificially limiting yourself to that particular ceiling. But if you're able to expand your horizon just a little bit, push that ceiling up just a little bit, it's pretty incredible, because even if you fail, you'll end up failing above your previous success.
Well, thank you. And I think you've brought a new dinner table question to my household, because I'll ask my children what they failed at today. So that's fantastic.
Great.
So we have two questions. If you have a question for Ozan, please put it in the question and answer tab, and I'll read this, and you can bring it up too, because I know that reading a question out loud and trying to really kind of get at what it is, I'll give you some time to pull those up. But the first question we have is, many of the biggest obstacles in rocket science, like in our lives in general, are problems we have not encountered yet and could not prepare directly for.
Mm-hmm.
How does a rocket scientist prepare for future tackling unknown problems?
Yeah, great question. So one of them is through practice and testing. So testing and experimenting is really important in rocket science. To be able to identify problems that may arise in the future, you basically try to simulate what will happen in space on Earth. You know, you expose every single component in a spacecraft to the same types of like vibrations and shocks they're going to experience in space. Astronauts, you know, they go through just rigorous training. You can train for 10 years and be in space for 4 days. So astronauts don't fly for a living; they actually train for a living. And the goal there is to, and the simulation supervisors, by the way, their goal on the ground is to kill the astronauts. To throw, which sounds really grim, I know, but the goal is to throw them every horrible scenario that can potentially come up in space, so that they know how to deal with it when those conditions arise, so that the ability to resolve those problems becomes second nature. And that principle is called test as you fly, fly as you test. Now, most of us don't do that in real life, or when we do tests, when we do experiments, we do so in conditions that actually don't mimic reality. So if you're getting ready for a job interview, for example, you practice in like your sweatpants and you're sitting in your living room, and then your significant other is like running through the questions with you. But that's not how the interview is going to go. The flight is going to be very different than the test conditions you created. If you really want to test as you fly and think like a rocket scientist, you would put on an uncomfortable suit. You would meet up with a stranger who's ready to throw curveballs at you. And one of the actually great legal examples of this is from Chief Justice John Roberts, who is, I think, known as one of the best oral advocates before the Supreme Court, before he became Chief Justice. And one of the things he would do to get ready for oral argument was to write hundreds, sometimes thousands of questions that he would expect to get from the bench. And then he wouldn't just practice them, in order. He would shuffle them, because he knew that he wouldn't get them in the order that he was writing them. And so shuffling them and then giving them to a stranger to ask him those questions was one way that he prepared. And then, when he finally got up to the lectern, he looked like he had heard the questions before, because he had, right? He had created the questions and he had practiced them in various different environments. One of the things that I also do is, like, when I'm practicing a new keynote, I'll give it before an audience of strangers, but I'll also drink a few espressos right before the keynote, to give myself the type of jitters that I'm going to experience on game day. I think if you're trying to practice a speech from the comfort of your home, you're not ready to solve the problems that you're going to encounter, because you haven't been training in those conditions. So that's one thing. The other thing that rocket scientists do is to try to be really versatile. To try to design instruments to be really versatile as well, because once you launch, in my case, we sent 2 rovers to Mars. Once you put the tools on board the rovers and send them into space, there is no turning back. There's no replacing the instruments. You can't, if something breaks, you can't just pop the hood and have a look inside. You're stuck with what you have. But what we can do is to learn to use the instruments to solve the problems that Mars threw at us, as opposed to the problems that we expected to solve. So one thing that happened with one of the rovers is the front wheel got stuck, and the navigators learned to drive the rover backward for the rest of its life. So for years, the rover went backward. Not ideal, but it worked. On another rover called Curiosity, the drilling system broke. And then the rocket scientists working on the mission, they devised a new way to create a way to drill using the functional components on board the spacecraft. They tested it on Earth, and then they beamed up instructions to space, and it worked beautifully. So that goes back to one of the ideas that I had mentioned in the talk itself, but we tend to grip the tools that we have. We tend to grip the problems that we expected to solve, but letting them go and asking yourself, all right, like, here's a whole new set of problems that I didn't even know coming down the pipeline, but how can I use the tools I have to solve these? Yeah, you haven't used the tools you have before you to solve that specific problem before, but you're far more adaptable than you give yourself credit for. So asking yourself, how can I take this familiar tool and apply it in an unfamiliar way, is another way to bring a rocket science mindset to problem solving.
Great. Let's move on to our next question. How do you deal with divergent thinking in a convergent society or situation? How do you capitalize on moonshot thinking when constrained by outside organizations?
Yeah, great question. And we can devote a whole hour to talking about this. So I'll just give one idea, maybe one or two ideas, but one is to start really small. No one changes an organization overnight, and often we tend to look to the leaders of the organizations for change. But if you're operating within a system that is not conducive to divergent thinking, is not conducive to top-down change, then the change has to happen from the bottom up. And the way it happens, by the way, is, start small. So with your team or your division, begin to apply divergent thinking, begin to apply moonshot thinking. And when the other teams in the organization begin to see what you're able to accomplish, they will come to you and ask you what you're doing differently. But if you try to impose that way of thinking on other people, it tends to backfire. But if you lead by example, and if you start small, I think that's really the way to go if you're within an organization that's not conducive to this sort of thinking. And then one other tactic that I'll mention here, to the extent that, so most brainstorming sessions tend to be terrible. They are where good ideas go to die. And it's often because the loudest voices tend to dominate the conversation. And the voices of we can't because also dominate the conversation. Giving people time to brainwrite, so work in isolation first, generate problems in isolation, generate ideas in isolation, and then go to a brainstorming setting to share those ideas with the group anonymously if possible. So everybody would submit the ideas to a pool. So you're not having the dynamic of the loudmouth extroverts basically dominating the conversation. That is a great way to generate ideas, and then you can go into brainstorming and put those ideas through the convergent thinking lens. But the groups, and the research bears this out too, the groups that alternate between those modes of isolation, interaction, tend to generate much better, much original, more creative ideas than the groups that are in like current interaction or complete isolation from one another.
And I just wrote down the word brainwriting. I love that idea. It speaks for itself. That's great. So do you have any advice for today's international students dreaming of following in your footsteps, but facing barriers to studying and working in the United States?
Yeah, first of all, my heart goes out to you. I was privileged enough to be, as an international student, to be in an environment which was much more welcoming to immigrants than the current situation we find ourselves in. And so much of what you're facing is completely outside of your control. So let me begin by saying that I think the next thing to think about is like, hopefully we'll see some change in a few months. But before then, thinking through ways of legally staying and working in the United States. And so one of the things that I try to do, and by the way, I didn't become a US citizen until 2016. I got my green card maybe 2 years before then. And before then I was jumping from one visa type to the next. But I tried to identify opportunities where I could work with a work visa, and Lewis and Clark was instrumental to getting my green card. And so I think if you're entering the legal profession, trying to think ahead and thinking through what types of jobs, what types of industries, what types of fields within the legal profession are going to be more conducive to lawyers with an international background. So like immigration law might be one example of that, where your skills and resources are going to be valued, and also thinking through what's going to set me up to the extent that your goal is to stay in the United States long term. What type of environment is going to make it easier for my employer to get me a green card, to get me a long-term work visa? Those are some of the questions that I was asking myself when I was first starting out. But like I said, it's a very tough situation right now. So my heart goes out to you, with the hope that things hopefully changes coming down the pipeline.
Well, we have about 4 minutes and 2 questions, so I think we can get it done. So our next question is, many or most of the best, most innovative lawyers clearly reason by first principles and use divergent thinking. Yet so much of legal reasoning and legal education is built on reasoning by analogy, perhaps the opposite of reasoning by first principles. How should an aspiring, world-changing attorney balance these methods?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, there is a lot of reasoning by analogy built in, as you said, to the legal system, because you're looking at like how a court has treated the issue before. And of course, that's because like the status quo bias is built into the legal system. It's called precedent. So we looked at what we've done before, and then we just apply that going forward. And so in some ways you're stuck operating within that system. But even when you're reasoning by analogy, there are ways to bring in first principles thinking. There are ways to look to what a court has done previously, but come up with creative ways to, for example, distinguish a precedent on point using first principles thinking. I think, I see this in my students a lot. They get discouraged when they see a case on point that seems to go the other side. There's always an argument you can make about why that case is different than the one that's before you. And of course, you can always ask the court to overrule precedent as well. But the reasoning by analogy and first principles thinking, I think, can go hand in hand in the legal system, even though you're stuck with precedent. Just ask yourself, how can I come up with a way of distinguishing this? And just 30-second example from rocket science. I mentioned reusability of rockets before. Elon Musk and SpaceX initially looked to NASA, which had tried reusability with the space shuttle. The parts of the space shuttle were reusable, but it was so expensive. Reusability for the space shuttle, it was more expensive to reuse the space shuttle than to have an entirely new space shuttle built. If you're reasoning by analogy and looking at that, and if you just accept that precedent, you say, well, all right, well, reusability is a non-starter. It didn't work for NASA, it's not gonna work for us. But SpaceX found out a creative way of distinguishing that particular precedent and said, well, the space shuttle reusability was really expensive because the space shuttle was a really complicated machine. If we can come up with a way of designing a simpler rocket, then reusability could actually make financial sense. And I think you can apply that same line of thinking to the law as well.
All right, and our final question, what stimulated your move from rocket science to law?
Yeah, so I get that question quite a bit. Quite the 180 I did. So I realized basically I became over time more drawn to the physics of society as opposed to actual physics. A lot of the classes I was taking were very theoretical, and which I just didn't enjoy. I've always been more interested in practical applications. And I had classmates who were far better at theoretical stuff. I just wasn't very good at it, to be honest with you. And it's because I didn't like it. And so for me to do anything with astrophysics long term would have required a PhD in astrophysics, and that would have been just torture for me. And I loved working on the Mars mission because that was very, very, very practical, but the substance of the classes I just didn't enjoy. And so that was the impetus for the for the pivot, I ended up taking a law class at Cornell that was taught by a law professor. And he only did it for undergrads. He used the Socratic method, he read actual cases, and I absolutely loved that, how practical that was. And I could take these critical thinking skills that I picked up in rocket science, the ability to see the issue from multiple perspectives, and apply them to this like seemingly completely unrelated field of law. And I really enjoy that. So that was the impetus for the switch. I know we're out of time here, so I'll stop. I'll also mention that if you're interested in keeping in touch with me, the best way to do it is through my email list. I share on a weekly basis just one big idea that you can read in 3 minutes or less. And you can sign up for that at weeklycontrarian.com. It goes out to about 24,000 subscribers. And then Think Like a Rocket Scientist is everywhere that books are sold. I hope you support your indie bookstore by picking up a book from them. They're facing some hard times right now, but the book is available everywhere.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us for the book talk today. And we appreciate your time, Ozan, and we appreciate the time that all of our participants have given to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.